It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mark Benfield. Dr. Mark Benfield is a professor in the College of the Coast and Environment, Department of Oceanography and Coastal Science at Louisiana State University. Mark got his bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Toronto, a master's degree in biological science from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and his PhD in wildlife and fisheries science from the Texas A&M University. His research examines plastic pollution and zooplankton ecology. Today, he's going to talk about a nurdle in a haystack. The 2020 Mississippi River plastic pellet spill reveals widespread pellet contamination from multiple sources. Welcome, Dr. Benfield.
Thanks, Rui, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a very recent event. This occurred in August of last year in the city of New Orleans, and it involved the spillage of a huge quantity of microplastic pellets from a vessel. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Elizabeth Marchio at Northeastern University, Kirsten Boswell, who's a student in my lab, and Amy Thomas from Loyola University in New Orleans. So let me tell you about what happened. So on the afternoon of August 2nd, 2020, a container ship, the MV CMA CGM Bianca, broke from its moorings during a storm. There was a very strong wind event, and the mooring line snapped, and this caused a number of cranes to topple over. And in the process, 4 40-foot shipping containers fell off the ship and entered the Mississippi River. 3 of the containers were empty. One was filled, however, with high-density polyethylene nurdles. And nurdles are the raw resin pellets that are used as the precursor for most plastic materials. All or part of the contents entered the Mississippi River, and actually how much was spilled remains the subject of some conjecture that I'll talk about in a moment. So a little more about nurdles. These are the items that one would make any plastic product from. They can be made from a variety of different polymers. They're fairly uniform in size and shape, though each batch of nurdles can be quite distinctive. So the shipping containers were recovered, but the container that contained the nurdles ruptured and discharged its contents into the river. At the time, CMA CGM, the shipping company, went quiet. They wouldn't talk to the Coast Guard or the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. They referred everyone to their lawyers, and they said they didn't know how much had been spilled. So we had to estimate how much had been lost. And so the basis for our estimation is from a similar spill that occurred in Durban Harbor in South Africa in October of 2010. In that particular case, 2 40-foot shipping containers, which were filled with high-density polyethylene and low-density polyethylene nurdles, fell into Durban Harbor, and the containers also ruptured. Well, it turns out that their estimates of how many were in those containers were based on the fact that the nurdles were packed in 25-kilogram sacks. Well, so were the nurdles from our spill. There you can fit 990 of these 25-kilogram sacks into a 40-foot standard container. The weight was 24.75 metric tons, or 24,750,000 grams. By taking the nurdles from our spill and averaging about 100 of them, we came out with an average mass of 0.033 grams per nurdle. So if you do some basic math, you come up with approximately 750 million nurdles, being the maximum number that could have been spilt in the Bianca spill in New Orleans. And that is the number that we're working from right now until we can get a better estimate. This was a substantial spill. This is a picture taken near the French Quarter in New Orleans. So if you've been to New Orleans, you know that just a little bit downriver from the French Quarter, there's some sandbars. And so here's a picture that was taken about 2 weeks after the spill. And you can see the vast quantity of nurdles that are distributed on the shoreline. So this really We tend to think, given the abundance of nurdles, that the majority of these sacs did enter the river, and a lot of them opened up and ruptured. However, I'll just go back and show you that we've got one of those sacs here. In fact, I have two of them in my lab. Two of them were recovered intact, or more or less intact, from the shores of the Mississippi River. One was completely intact and remained sealed and dry. The other one had torn open partially and the contents were wet, but it was largely intact. Just to give you an idea of what it looked like, the video on the left you're seeing is some video I shot slowed down here. This is underneath the Governor Nichols Wharf, so that's a little bit further downriver from the last picture that I showed you. And it just shows the large quantity of these nurdles that are distributed along the shoreline. We went out and we were using 1 foot by 1 foot quadrats and 2 foot by 2 foot quadrats to try and quantify the distribution and abundance of these nurdles. So the questions we want to ask are, where did they go? And we believe that the majority of the nurdles likely stayed in the river and entered the Gulf of Mexico fairly quickly. However, large quantities were deposited along the shoreline downstream of the Crescent City Connection Bridge, which is that large bridge that you see if you're in New Orleans. The spill occurred just a little bit upstream of that. And so our approach has been to go out to each of these sites and randomly sample using these 1 foot by 1 foot or 2 foot by 2 foot quadrats to collect quantitative samples of the nurdles. Just to show you where our sampling sites are, the spill actually occurred. Here's the Crescent City Connection Bridge. The spill occurred in this general vicinity of the river, and we're sampling at stations all the way downriver as far as about Belle Chase Ferry. In addition, large numbers of concerned citizens had also turned up in their neighborhoods to collect samples and remove nurdles in the vicinity of where they happened to find them. Basically, our sample processing involved taking these samples, drying them, because there's a large number of woody objects in there. There's a lot of other plastic in there. And we would then take a subsample of nurdles, calculate their mean weight, again 0.033 grams. We would run FTIR spectra on selected nurdles. We would count the numbers per square meter. We'd also quantify the weights of micro and macro plastic from these samples. We'd measure the overall area of shoreline in each of our sample areas and try and predict, based on the densities per square meter from our quadrats multiplied by the overall square meter area of the samples, the total numbers of nurdles at each site. And we sampled repeatedly. We wanted to see how these nurdles were being moved downstream, how many were remaining on the shoreline. The sample processing is ongoing, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is very much a work in progress, but some interesting findings and some interesting questions. So here's some samples that have been dried and picked. Let's take a look at example abundances. So this is a site near the Jean Lafitte National Park, the Chalmette Battlefield. This is the site of the Revolutionary War, or sorry, the War of 1812 battle between the British and the American forces. This is the beach here, and you can see the nurdle density on the y-axis in numbers per square meters. The confidence bars here are 98% confidences on the mean, and the sampling dates are along here. And you can see that the spill occurred on the 4th. This first sample was collected on the 13th. And I should digress and say, you might ask, why did sampling only commence on the 13th? The spill wasn't announced anywhere, and the company didn't say anything about it, nor did the Coast Guard. And so it wasn't until about the 10th that a concerned citizen saw these pellets on the shoreline, put it on the media, and after that we got down there and started sampling. And what you can see is that these high densities rapidly decayed as the river levels rose and washed these samples down. We also had a lot of rain. We had a couple of tropical storms in this period, which flushed a lot of these nurdles off the beaches. And so between August and October, the numbers dropped dramatically. So what do these nurdles look like? Well, they're high density polyethylene. I've given you their average mass. The 95% confidence intervals on the mean mass are between 0.0323 and 0.0336, so fairly uniform masses. They're cylindrical at one end. They're cylindrical with one flared end. They're convex on the flared end and slightly concave, a little dimple on the narrow end. And if you look at the dimensions, they're about 3.24 meters high, and at their maximum width, about 4.78 centimeters. The shapes of these nurdles will come into play in a little bit. You can see they look quite similar. These pictures were taken from one of the bags that we recovered that had dry nurdles in it. Here's what the spectrum looks like. We've run it through the IS-5 FTIR system with an ATR diamond accessory, and you can see a fairly characteristic spectrum for high density polyethylene. We didn't have reference spectra in our libraries. We had a lot of polymer libraries that were provided by Thermo Scientific when we got the instrument, but we didn't have reference spectra for these Dow nurdles. So what we did was we measured spectra from 10 nurdles randomly selected from the intact, that is the dry 25 kilogram sac, and another 10 nurdles from the sac that had torn and had allowed Mississippi River water to enter it. We dried all of those, and then we measured spectra, and we saved these spectra into our spectral library under the Bianca spill. So we had 20 reference nurdles, 10 from the dry sac, 10 from the wet sac. We also noticed there was quite a bit of color variation in the nurdles. The dry and the wet sac were all uniform pale. They look kind of like these ones on the right. But if you look at this picture from the sample, you can see there's some quite dark nurdles in here, and they range in color from a pale white color until you get down to sort of a green, olive green color. And we tried cleaning the nurdles with some detergent and agitation, and didn't change their colors. When we ran these spectra, did an FTIR on each of these nurdles, the 9 in this case that were discolored and the 9 that were more or less normally colored, we get spectral matches that are consistent with our reference spectra. In fact, the top 20 matches all corresponded to our 20 reference nurdles. And the matches, the mean match for the discolored was 94.6%. The mean for the lighter colored ones was 97.2, but there wasn't a statistically significant difference between them. The difference was at 0.1635. So these things morphologically are consistent with the Bianca spill. Their spectral signatures are consistent with the Bianca spill. However, it's interesting that this discoloration took place in some of them because presumably the nurdles that were washed up on a beach in a sample had spent about the same amount of time in the water and should have all had a similar appearance. So we're not exactly certain whether this indicates that these nurdles are somehow older, and if they are older, are they the same product but from a different time frame, spilled from a different time? We also noticed a lot of other nurdles in the samples. So here, my student workers have been picking out other microplastics and other nurdles, and so you can see what we discovered, and the sort of title that I use, A Nurdle in a Haystack, refers to the fact that we have all these nurdles from the Bianca spill, but when we started looking at them, we realized that we not only had Bianca spill nurdles, but we had a lot of other nurdles in there as well. And so we wanted to know whether these other nurdles had spectral signatures similar to the Bianca spill product, the Dow product, and also could we identify what these other nurdles were made up of, and that's very much an ongoing process. If you look at the proportions of the other nurdles, I'm just going to take, we took 24 samples from a site below Crescent Park in New Orleans, so it's a little bit downstream from the French Quarter. And on average, about 5.8% of them are other nurdles based on morphology. So the orange are the other nurdles, the blue are nurdles that are consistent with the Bianca spill morphology, and it ranges from 0 to 25% in these samples. So can we use then FTIR to do these other nurdles stand out as being different? And so we used our spectral libraries from the existing polymer libraries that were provided with the instrument, as well as our reference spectra for those 20 nurdles. And in some cases you can. So in this case, we have a spill nurdle on the left, and we've got an other nurdle on the right. You can see that this is much more opaque, the spill nurdle, compared to this other nurdle, which is more transparent. The other nurdle is much more oval, it's larger, it's got a different morphology. It turns out this matches to a spectrum for polyethylene polypropylene diene with a 92% match. The nearest match to our Dow reference spectra was 86.4%. In other cases, you can have clear morphological differences that aren't resolved by the FTIR spectra. So in this case, we have a Dow nurdle on the left, and we've got a nurdle from Piety Wharf collected on the 28th in quadrat number 1. And this had all of our top matches were to our Dow reference spectra from 95.4 to 98.9% matches. The nearest match to any other polymer was a polyethylene type F, which was 84.57%, much lower than our matches. So this is an interesting and somewhat problematic, and I think it points out that we need to have reference spectral libraries for the different types of nurdles to do a better kind of forensic analysis. Here's a sample that has mostly nurdles that look similar to, are consistent with in morphology with the Bianca spill nurdles, but there were a few that stood out. So this number 1 here was a 95.2 to a 99.3% match to Bianca spill nurdles. The nearest non-spill match was polyethylene type F at 84%. Here's another one, number 2 up here that's highlighted in red. Again, it seems to be consistent with the Bianca spill nurdles, and the nearest non-spill match again was polyethylene type F at 78%. The third one, also same result, consistent with the Bianca spill nurdles. So we were able to take these nurdles and putatively assign them to Bianca spill nurdles. However, this one looks quite different. It's really, you may not be able to see it in that picture, but it's very round. It also matched to the Bianca spill nurdles between 95 and 98.8%. It was 85.2% match to polyethylene type F. If we look at it up close, you can see how different it is. It's much more transparent, and it's much more cylindrical. However, it's giving us a similar morphology. And I'll point out another case where we had this kind of similar morphology, even though morphologically these nurdles don't look the same. We wanted to see if the nurdles had arrived in the Gulf of Mexico, so we went down to the coast to Elmer's Island, which is a beach on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. And lo and behold, there were nurdles all over the ground that looked all over the dunes, and they looked like nurdles from the Bianca spill. When you got them under the microscope, though, they looked a little bit different. They were convex on both sides. They were a little more compressed in the middle. They just didn't look like the Bianca spill. However, in terms of translucence and color, they did. They gave us high spectral matches to our spill nurdles, despite the fact being subtly dissimilar morphology. And the mean percentage matches from one sample I looked at was about 97.8%. So I think what we discovered in this case was another nurdle spill, quite a substantial one, probably dumped from a vessel offshore, which made its way to Elmer's Island. But because of the polymer is very similar to the Dow material, and perhaps it was even manufactured by Dow, we're getting a similar match. So really, this means we've got some future work to do. We've got to obtain samples of pure nurdles from other manufacturers, and there are a lot of different plants that make nurdles upstream of New Orleans. Between Baton Rouge and New Orleans is an area called Chemical Alley. nicknamed Chemical Alley, and there are a lot of plants there that produce polymers and nurdles. And we'd like to obtain nurdles so we can get reference spectra and create libraries for each of these different types of nurdles. That may be problematic. I'm sure the manufacturers don't necessarily want us to have that information, but we can also go and sample in the vicinity of their outfalls and potentially collect some. There's other ways of getting these nurdles. We want to use these nurdles to create library spectra so that we can start to parse out where these other nurdles came from, because clearly there's a chronic nurdle spill problem in the Mississippi River, which we would not have been aware of without this huge spill from the MV Bianca. We also need to do some work on weathering and its impact on spectra. So my co-author, M.A. Thomas, took her students and they exposed pure product from our reference sacs to ultraviolet light over a period of time, and we're looking at how the spectra change. We also want to estimate the overall loss from the system so we can try and understand how much went into the Gulf of Mexico. This spill was completely ignored by the regulatory agencies, the Coast Guard, the EPA, the DEQ, because they said it was not toxic and it didn't fall under Clean Water Act guidelines. However, these same nurdles are made into a lot of products which we use every day, like shopping bags, plastic shopping bags. And I guarantee you, if I went and took millions of shopping bags and started throwing them into the Gulf of Mexico, someone would, or into the New Orleans, the Mississippi at New Orleans, people would have taken notice and stopped me. So it points out a problem from a policy perspective in dealing with spills of these raw resin pellets. We know the Formosa plastic pellet spill in Point Comfort, Texas, resulted in a huge fine and penalties from the federal government. So we're hoping that we can draw attention to the problems that these nurdles pose from this spill and from other spills. So I'll wrap up there. I want to thank Scott Eustace with Healthy Gulf, who's been instrumental in collecting a lot of these samples, Julie Dermansky, Kimberly Cook, students in my lab, Sophia, Nicole, Mia, and Rachel, the citizens who just mobilized and did an amazing job in responding to this spill and have been sending us lots of samples. There's a Facebook page you can visit, the GNO Plastic Pellet Cleanup Crew, and Jace Tunnel, who's got an amazing project called Nurdle Patrol based in Texas, and we've been contributing data to his project as well. So thank you for your time.